I am in Dartpad. I went ahead and copied and pasted just 3 items from the forloops.dart file, and that is the creation of the list, the set, and my map. So my list is ABC, my set is XYZ, remember sets don't have a retained order, and then my map is A0, B1, and then C2. Okay, so let's begin with the loop list methods, that is the methods on iterables. So if I want to create a for loop that does some action for every item in that list, so for example, I want to print every item in my list, I'm going to say for, and then in parentheses, we define the variable, that is the temporary variable name I'm going to use for each item. So we want to make it clear. So for example, I can say for every final item in my list, I will go ahead and print out the item. Then I run this and I should see ABC each on a new line. And there you have it, ABC. Now something to keep in mind that I want to make super clear, you can call this item whatever you want. So I can say final letter. Obviously you want to avoid things like naming it another variable. I don't want to say final my list or for in my list. You don't want to get confused. It should be its own unique variable that's not defined elsewhere in your code, which is why you kind of want to use temporary things or things that make sense, like for letter in my list, print the letter, I run that, and then I'm going to see, well, ABC again. But remember, these letters are just string objects, which means I can call things on this. So because this is just a string, I can call something like to uppercase on that string. So what is this going to do? Well, it should print out ABC, but in all uppercase this time. So I should see now ABC in all uppercase on separate lines. And there you have it. Okay, not too shabby. So that is the method for iterating through a list with a for loop. Now let's show you how to do it with a set. Keep in mind, a set is essentially the same thing. I just swap out, instead of my list, my set, and because these are also letters, I can do the exact same thing. I run this, and I should now see XYZ, but they're in all caps. So pretty much the exact same syntax and notation for the list and the set. But again, and I cannot stress this enough because I always get questions about this, the set does not retain an order. At least there's no guarantee of retaining the order. Even though it looks that way, even for small sets, don't keep that guarantee in mind. It doesn't guarantee any sort of order. If you need order, choose a list. So that is how you can iterate through iterables such as a list and a set. But what about the map? Well, the map, let's go ahead and explore that. Remember, we discussed 2 separate ways to iterate through the map. First, I'm going to do the way that's more similar to what we just described, which is actually getting the keys. So if I print out my map.keys, what is this actually? Well, it's going to kind of look like a list of keys, except remember, it's technically its own special type. So if I now print out the runtime type of this and run it, it's going to tell me it's like the special iterable thing. So it's a linked hash map key iterable. So something that's easy to remember, just kidding. And the main thing I need to remember is I can just access those keys inside my loop and iterate them just like I did through the list. So I essentially use the exact same syntax. I'm going to say for, and we can say final key in my map.keys. I can perform some action in this loop. So for example, I can print out each of those keys. I can run that, and then I should see the keys of the dictionary, A, B, C. So those are the keys. Now what if I only wanted the values? Well, I would just say in my map, reference the key. Note that I'm not passing in key as a string. Key is the actual variable, which is the ABC call. So here I should expect 0, 1, 2, since I'm accessing the value at each key. And there you have it, 0, 1, 2. Something I want to stress that is sometimes confusing to students is, technically speaking, I do not need to use key at all. I could just print hello. So if I were to just print hello, what would actually happen here? Well, there are 3 keys in this iterable object, but I'm just saying for each of those keys, perform an action. I don't necessarily need to use that key. So here you're just going to see hello printed 3 times, and Dart has no complaints. Now, why would you actually do this? I don't know. It's not super useful to define a for loop based off the keys here and not even use the keys. For that, you would probably want to do a loop via iteration, but I do want to point out that you don't necessarily need to use the items in your list or your set or the keys. It's really up to you what you do in this block of code. You're just going to do it for as many times as there are items in your iterable object. Okay, so With that being said, we've gone through the main notation for iterating through iterables, and that was a list, a set, and the keys iterable. But I also mentioned that maps have this special for each. Now, you really got to pay close attention here. In fact, I'm going to zoom in. Pay close attention because it's a little confusing where the parentheses and the braces or brackets go. So let's take a look at the for each method. So I'm going to say my map dot, and then I'm going to call for each. And you should actually see it want to complete this for you. So if you click on that, the next thing that shows up is the parentheses. But if you highlight for each, this is where you want to take advantage of the documentation. If you scroll down here in the documentation, I'm actually quite zoomed in, but you can see it has the syntax. And this is where you got to pay attention on where the parentheses are. Notice it has two parentheses here, but then only one parentheses here. It's printing something, and then that last parentheses actually goes after this curly braces, and it requires a semicolon. So you want to be super careful. This is one where even I make typos all the time of like, oh, darn it, I forgot a parentheses, or forgot that semicolon. So pay very close attention, be very careful here. If you're ever confused, you can just copy and paste this example from the documentation, but let me show you how it's done. So the for each, that's going to require a key value. So typically we're going to say is just key value. And then in this key value, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my curly braces. Note where my last parentheses went. It went outside of this. And then I do something for each of these. So for example, I can print out the key. And then here, I need to remember to also put the semicolon. So why does it look so complicated and so strange? Well, technically speaking, for each is just a method. And sometimes this notation actually kind of makes more sense if you were to do it all on one line and kind of see the idea that way. So what you're doing is saying for each, and then you're kind of almost like a list comprehension in other languages. You're using a key value and then doing something inside the braces, closing off that method call, and then using the semicolon. So let's run this and see what we expect to occur. So if I run that, I'm saying for each key value, I see A, B, C. If you get an error, it's extremely likely that you managed to misplace a parenthesis. So again, notice where my parentheses are here and where the last parentheses and semicolon are here. So be very careful with these brackets, braces, and parentheses. But now that I have the key and the value, I can do whatever I want with them. So I can also print out, just to make it super obvious, let's use a little bit of string formatting, the value for $key is, and then I print out the value. So run that, and we should see, whoops, make sure we put the semicolon. Like I said, very easy to make typos. And let's actually comment that one out as well. So I should see three statements that say the value for A is 0, value for B is 1, and the value for C is 2. And there they are. Okay, so that is the for each method. Definitely takes a little bit of time to get used to that notation, but you will see that. Finally, I want to show you probably the most common way of iterating. In fact, if you start a new pad, it's the default method, and it's going to be looping through iteration. So what does this look like? Well, you say for, and then inside you have your parentheses, and then curly braces, the block of code you want to run. So the block of code, I'm just going to print out, let's say, hello. So we're kind of following the hello world example that comes with Dartpad. So what does this look like again? Remember, you define your starting point. So that is the initiation, then the condition you're checking for, and then the iteration. So it's an initiation, condition, and then iteration, or your initialization really. So let's take a look at these. The other thing to remember is these are technically, they should be separated by semicolons internally. So let's start an initialization of a variable. I'm going to say variable, and it's really often you'll see it be I, so we'll follow that convention. So I'm going to start with I equal to 0, and then I'm going to do this, let's say, up to 3 times, and then my iteration, I'll just keep adding 1 to this. I'm going to say plus plus, and then I'm going to print hello. So think about what's happening here. I should see hello printed out, whoops, with the semicolon. I should see hello printed out 3 times when I run this. And there it is. So why 3 times? Because it's 0, then 1, then 2, and then we fail to be less than 3, so we get an equals there. Now, how else could I use this style of iteration with a list or maybe even a map? Well, a list is the most common way you'll actually see this iteration, so let's show you that method. So I already have I, which looks and feels a lot like an index. What I need to do is set the condition to be based off this list. So you'll often see something like this. As long as I is less than the length of my list, keep doing something. So for example, I can print out the item at index I is, and then I can go ahead and grab that item. So I can say, let's make sure we put our semicolon there. I can print out my list and then I. And then if you want, you can also print out new lines. So you can print out new lines using the notation \n. So this will just put a little spacing here so it's easier to read the output in the console. But what am I doing here? Remember, i's are just numbers, and now I'm limiting it to the length of the list. So when I run this, I get back the following. I see the item at index 0 is a new line. The item at index 1 is B, a new line. The item at index 2 is C. So that is how you can use the iteration method in conjunction with a list. And this is actually quite common to see. And some people really like thinking this way of, okay, I'm iterating through the index positions of the list rather than iterating through the items in a list. So two different ways about thinking of iteration through a list. Either I'm iterating tasks in Dartpad. So here we are with the exercise text pasted into Dartpad. So something to keep in mind here is there's actually 3 tasks, but they all pretty much pertain to the same list. So task 1 is to use a for loop with iterable iteration to print out the numbers in the list. Basically, I mean using the in keyword operator. In task 2, I want you to also print out the numbers in my list, except this time use the incrementation method that used I++. Remember we showed you the 2 different methods that you could use. We want you to make sure you understand those and use both methods to accomplish the same task. Then in task 3, this is going to be kind of the hard one because it does 2 things. It combines ideas from the if-else lectures along with for loop ideas, and you're going to need to look up an operator. Now we did give you kind of some heavy hints here. We actually linked to the arithmetic operator that is the modulo operator in order to solve this, but I won't go too deep into that hint yet. But essentially task 3 is you can use any loop type, either the one from task 1 or the one from task 2, but I want you to only print out the even numbers in this list. So you should only be printing out 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, which means you need to figure out 1 or 2 things. You need to figure out how can I actually tell if a number is even using programming. That's where this is the big hint, the modulo operator. If you know what that means, then you already know it's %sign. If you don't know what that means, you can check out this link in the documentation to figure it out on your own, or you can just watch for the solution. The second thing you need to understand is, remember the for loop is just a block of code that gets executed for each item in that list. So you're going to need to perform some sort of if check to see, hey, is this actually an even number? If so, then execute the print code. So you'll actually start to nest different types of control flow statements. So you should see an if block of code inside that for loop block of code. Okay, those are your 3 tasks. I'm going to count down in 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to start on the solution. Pause the video now if you do not want to see me go through a solution. So task 1, I think this is actually kind of the easier one of the 2. So, or I should say of the 3. And what we want to do is simply start off with a for loop, and then we're going to say for final item in my list. Then I'm going to just print out the item. And that's pretty much it. And as you get more and more used to this, this will come more naturally to you. Let me zoom out just a little bit. Whoops. Control minus there. So you can see the whole thing on the console. So I should see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. all on new lines. Okay, so that's how we can print out the numbers using this method. What about the second method? So that wanted me to use the increment method. So how does that work? Well, remember, I start with a for, and then I have my initial variable, the condition I'm checking for, and then the increment. So in that case, basically by convention, you're always going to see this as I, or almost always, depending on the use case. The thing to remember that sometimes people forget is these should be semicolons, not commas. So I'm going to start off with I equal to 0. I'm going to keep going until I is less than my list.length. And the reason I say less than and not less than or equal to is because indexing starts at 0. And then I'm going to say I++. So we did this in the lecture. and then I'm going to print, and this time, because I don't have a variable name to reference, I have to index from my list the item at index location I. I'm going to go ahead and print this, and we technically shouldn't see any change in the result. We'll just see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so that was task 2, using a for loop with incrementation I++, and we were able to print out each item. Now it's time for task 3. Use any loop type to only print out the even numbers. So how can you actually check if a number is even? This is where that modulo operator comes into play. This returns back the remainder after you divide something. So for example, let's imagine I have 4 divided by 2. So I'm going to print out the result of 4 divided by 2. And I run that, and I should get back 2. Now what is the remainder there? Well, there is no remainder because 2 goes into 4 2 times. But what if I do 5 divided by 2? Well, in this case, we're actually going to get back a double, which is 2.5. But if I think about this in kind of fraction terms, the remainder is technically 1 because I have 2 plus 2 and then remainder 1. So you can think back to kind of grade school arithmetic. When you perform a division, you get back some sort of remainder. In this case, the remainder is 1. So how can I actually grab this remainder instead of getting terms of 0.5? In that case, what I do is I use the modulo operator. The modulo operator returns the remainder. So if I say 5 mod or modulo 2, then I should get back that remainder, which if we run it is 1. Let's double check our understanding by running this with a different number. Let's say I run this with, let's say 6. 6 mod 2, well, that's 2 plus 2 plus 2 with a remainder of 0, right? Because 2 goes into 6 3 times evenly. So when I run this, I should see 0 as the output. And there you have it. Okay, so if I modulate, or excuse me, if I perform modulo 2 on a number and I get back remainder 0, then by definition, that number is even. So I could just check if a number mod 2 is equal to 0. And then suddenly I have a Boolean condition. And remember, Boolean conditions are what we need for if statements. And now notice this is now returning true or false. So let's do 7. 7 is an odd number, so 7 mod 2 is going to not be equal to 0, so I should expect a false there. And there it is. So how can I take this knowledge and actually perform the loop? Well, I'll simply say for final item in my list, if the item mod 2 is equal to 0, then I'm going to print the item. And let's go ahead and comment that one out and see if this actually works. So I'm going to run this, and I should see 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay, so again, I'm doing the exact same for loop as we did in task 1, except this time I'm adding in this if statement check. So for every item, I'm checking, is it fully divisible by 2? If so, then I know it's even, and then I can print out the item. All right, that's it for this exercise. Hopefully you found it just challenging enough. I'll see you at the next lecture.